The barn smelled of hay and earth, a quiet sanctuary where Ethan could lose himself in the rhythm of work. He was alone, or so he thought, until the creak of the door shattered the silence. A shadow fell across the hay-strewn floor, and there he was, a cowboy, boots caked in mud, grinning like he owned the world. Ethan's breath caught, his grip tightening on the pitchfork. Montana's endless skies stretched outside, but in here, the air felt too small, too charged. He'd seen Caleb around the ranch, always a blur of confidence, always untouchable, but never this close, never with that reckless smile aimed right at him. "You're making a mess," Ethan said, his voice steadier than he felt, nodding at the muddy footprints trailing behind Caleb. He was 23, wiry from years of labor, with eyes that held too many secrets for a small-town kid. The barn was his refuge, a place to escape the whispers of Bozeman, where being different wasn't just noticed, it was judged. Caleb leaned against a post, his hat tipped back, revealing a face carved by sun and wind. "Messes are my specialty," he drawled, his voice low, teasing. He was older, maybe 30, with a swagger that screamed trouble. "You're Ethan, right? The kid who's always out here hiding." "I'm not hiding," Ethan snapped, shoving the pitchfork into a bale. But he was. He'd been hiding since he was 16, when he'd overheard his father call his feelings unnatural in a hushed, angry tone. The barn was safe. The world outside wasn't. Caleb stepped closer, his boots scuffing the floor. "Could have fooled me. You're out here scrubbing stalls like the world's ending. Something chasing you." His eyes, sharp and green, held Ethan's, daring him to answer. Ethan turned away, focusing on the hay, the dust, anything but Caleb's gaze. "Just doing my job. You should try it sometime." His heart hammered, betraying the calm he tried to project. Caleb's presence was a spark in a dry field. One wrong move, and everything could ignite. The cowboy chuckled, a sound that curled around Ethan's defenses. "Oh, I work plenty, but I like a little fun, too." He reached into his pocket, pulling out a flask. "Care for a sip? Looks like you could use it." Ethan hesitated. He didn't drink, not after watching his uncle spiral into a bottle. But Caleb's offer wasn't just about whiskey. It was a challenge, a test. "No thanks," he said, brushing past Caleb to grab a broom. Their shoulders grazed, and Ethan's skin prickled, a warning and a thrill all at once. "Suit yourself." Caleb took a swig, his throat bobbing, and Ethan couldn't help but watch. The cowboy was trouble, no doubt. Too bold, too brash, too everything Ethan had learned to avoid. Yet something about him tugged at Ethan, like a rope pulling him toward a cliff. They worked in silence for a while, Ethan sweeping, Caleb hauling feed bags with an ease that spoke of years on the ranch. The sun dipped lower, painting the barn in shades of amber. Ethan stole glances, catching the way Caleb's muscles flexed under his worn denim shirt, the way his grin never quite faded. "You from around here?" Caleb asked, breaking the quiet. He was stacking bags now, his movements deliberate but casual, like he had all the time in the world. "Born and raised," Ethan said, keeping his eyes on the floor. "You?" "Drifter," Caleb replied, his tone light, but his eyes distant. "Been all over. Texas, Wyoming, even California for a spell. This place is just a stop." Ethan's stomach twisted. A drifter. Of course. Caleb was the kind of man who didn't stay, who left hearts and havoc in his wake. Ethan had seen it before, guys like Caleb, charming and gone by sunrise. He shouldn't care. He didn't. But when Caleb's hand brushed his as they both reached for the same bucket, Ethan froze. The touch was brief, accidental, but it burned. Caleb didn't pull back right away, his fingers lingering a heartbeat too long. "Careful," Caleb murmured, his voice softer now, almost intimate. "You're gonna wear out that broom." Ethan jerked his hand back, his face hot. "I'm fine," he muttered, turning to the next stall. He didn't trust himself to look at Caleb, not with his pulse racing like it was. This was dangerous. Caleb was dangerous. As the sun sank below the horizon, the barn grew dim, the air cooler. Caleb didn't leave. He stayed, helping with chores Ethan hadn't asked for help with, his presence a steady hum in the background. Ethan wanted to hate it, wanted to send him away, but the truth was, he didn't. For the first time in years, the barn didn't feel so lonely. By the time they finished, the stars were out, sharp and bright against the Montana sky. Caleb leaned against the barn door, wiping sweat from his brow. "Not bad for a city boy," he said, smirking. "I'm not a city boy," Ethan shot back, but there was no heat in it. He was tired, his muscles aching, but there was something else, too. A spark he hadn't felt in a long time. Hope, maybe, or something riskier. Caleb's grin widened, like he knew something Ethan didn't. "We'll see about that." He tipped his hat, a gesture both mocking and genuine, and walked out into the night, his boots leaving fresh mud on the floor. Ethan stood alone again, the barn quiet once more. But Caleb's smile lingered in his mind, reckless and bright, promising trouble, and maybe something more. The next morning, Ethan woke to the sound of hooves on gravel and the faint scent of coffee drifting from the ranch house. He'd barely slept, Caleb's grin haunting his dreams, stirring feelings he'd buried deep. He told himself it was nothing, just a drifter's charm, fleeting and meaningless, but his heart didn't listen. He headed to the barn early, hoping work would drown out the noise in his head. The Montana air was crisp, the mountains looming in the distance like silent judges. Ethan grabbed a shovel, ready to lose himself in the familiar ache of labor, when he heard it, a low whistle, playful and unmistakable. Caleb stood in the doorway, his silhouette framed by the dawn. "You're up early," he said, his voice warm, like he was picking up a conversation they'd never finished. His boots were still muddy, his hat tilted just so, and that reckless smile was back, sharper than ever. "Didn't expect you back," Ethan said, his tone guarded. He turned to the stalls, shoveling manure with more force than necessary. Caleb's presence was a disruption, a crack in the walls Ethan had built around himself. "Couldn't stay away," Caleb replied, stepping inside. He grabbed a rake, joining Ethan without being asked. "This place grows on you. Or maybe it's the company." Ethan's cheeks burned, but he kept his eyes on the ground. "Don't flatter yourself." He wanted to sound sharp, dismissive, but his voice betrayed a tremor. Caleb was too close, his movements too easy, like he belonged here. It unnerved Ethan, how natural it felt. They worked side by side, the barn filling with the sounds of scraping tools and shifting hay. Caleb talked as they worked, his stories spilling out like water. Tales of bar fights in Texas, starry nights in Wyoming, a near-death tumble from a horse in Nevada. Ethan listened, despite himself, drawn to the cadence of Caleb's voice, the way it painted a life so different from his own. "You ever think about leaving?" Caleb asked suddenly, pausing to wipe his brow. His eyes locked on Ethan's, searching, like he could see the weight Ethan carried. Ethan shrugged, his throat tight. Got nowhere to go. Bozeman was all he'd ever known. Its judgmental stares, its suffocating expectations. Leaving meant risking everything. His family, his job, the fragile peace he'd carved out. But staying meant hiding, always hiding. Caleb didn't push. Instead, he tossed Ethan a water bottle, their fingers brushing again. This time, Ethan didn't pull away so fast. The touch lingered in his mind, a spark he couldn't ignore. By noon, the heat was relentless, and they took a break under the barn's awning. Caleb pulled out a sandwich, offering half to Ethan. "Made it myself," he said, grinning. "Don't worry, I didn't poison it." Ethan took it, their hands grazing once more. He bit into the sandwich, the simple act of sharing food feeling strangely intimate. "You're not as tough as you act," he said, the words slipping out before he could stop them. Caleb laughed, a sound that echoed in the quiet. "And you're not as quiet as you pretend." He leaned closer, his shoulder brushing Ethan's. "Bet there's a wild side in there somewhere." Ethan's heart raced, his defenses crumbling under Caleb's gaze. He wanted to argue, to push back, but the truth was, Caleb saw him, really saw him, in a way no one else ever had. It was terrifying. It was exhilarating. The afternoon passed in a blur of work and stolen glances. Caleb's stories grew quieter, more personal. A sister he hadn't seen in years, a father who'd never understood him. Ethan found himself sharing, too, bits of his life he'd never spoken aloud. The church sermons that made him feel small, the nights he'd spent staring at the stars, wishing he could be someone else. As the sun began to set, Caleb paused, leaning on his rake. You ever feel like you're waiting for something, but you don't know what? His voice was soft, almost vulnerable, a crack in his usual bravado. Ethan nodded, his chest tight. All the time. He didn't know what he was waiting for. Not until Caleb looked at him, his green eyes steady, unguarded. For a moment, the world felt possible, like Ethan could be more than the kid hiding in the barn. But then a shout broke the spell. Jake, the ranch foreman, calling for Caleb. The cowboy tipped his hat, his grin returning, but it was softer now, meant just for Ethan. See you tomorrow, city boy, he said, and walked away, leaving Ethan alone with a racing heart and a dangerous hope. Days turned into a rhythm, each one marked by Caleb's arrival at the barn. Ethan began to anticipate it, the creak of the door, the flash of that reckless smile. It was a routine that felt anything but routine, each moment with Caleb charged with something Ethan couldn't name. One morning, as they mucked out stalls, Caleb's hand lingered on Ethan's shoulder, steadying him as he stumbled over a loose board. The touch was brief but deliberate, and Ethan's skin burned where Caleb's fingers had been. Watch your step, Caleb said, his voice low, his eyes holding Ethan's a beat too long. Ethan pulled away, his heart pounding. I'm fine, he muttered, but he wasn't. Caleb's presence was unraveling him, stirring feelings he'd locked away years ago. He tried to focus on the work, but his mind kept drifting to Caleb's laugh, his stories, the way he seemed to see right through Ethan's defenses. That afternoon, a storm rolled in, the sky darkening with heavy clouds. They moved the horses into the barn, the air thick with the scent of rain. As thunder rumbled, Caleb grabbed Ethan's arm, pulling him under the awning just as the downpour began. They stood close, rain drumming around them, the world shrinking to the space between their bodies. You scared of storms? Caleb asked, his grin teasing but his eyes soft. Ethan shook his head, his throat dry. Not storms. He didn't say what he was scared of, didn't need to. Caleb's gaze said he already knew. The rain trapped them there, and for once, Ethan didn't mind. Caleb told stories of riding through storms, of nights spent under open skies, his voice a steady anchor against the chaos outside. Ethan listened, letting himself imagine a life where he could be that free, that fearless. When the rain eased, Caleb didn't move away. Instead, he reached out, brushing a stray piece of hay from Ethan's hair. The gesture was so gentle, so unexpected, that Ethan froze, his breath hitching. You've got a good heart, Ethan, Caleb said, his voice barely above a whisper. Don't let this town steal it. Ethan's chest ached, the words hitting deeper than they should. He wanted to say something, anything, but the moment passed, and Caleb stepped back, his grin returning like a shield. Come on, he said. Horses won't feed themselves. The rest of the day was a blur, but Caleb's words stayed with Ethan, looping through his mind. He'd spent years building walls, keeping people out, but Caleb was slipping through the cracks, and Ethan wasn't sure he wanted to stop him. That evening, as they finished up, Caleb lingered by the barn door, his hat in his hands. You ever been to the ridge? He asked, nodding toward the hills beyond the ranch. Best view in Montana. Stars like you wouldn't believe. Ethan hesitated. He knew what Caleb was offering. Not just a view, but a moment, a chance to step out of the cage he'd built around himself. Maybe, he said, his voice cautious but curious. Caleb's smile was slow, knowing. I'll hold you to that. He walked into the dusk, leaving Ethan with a mix of fear and longing he couldn't shake. The next day, Ethan overheard Jake talking to another ranch hand about Caleb. Drifter like him won't stay long, Jake said, his tone dismissive. He's trouble. Always is. The words were a cold splash of reality, reminding Ethan of the risk he was taking, letting Caleb get too close. But when Caleb showed up at the barn that evening, his grin as reckless as ever. Ethan's doubts faltered. They worked late, the barn glowing under the soft light of a lantern. Caleb was quieter than usual, his stories replaced by a thoughtful silence. When they finished, he didn't leave. Instead, he sat on a hay bale, patting the space beside him. Ethan sat, their knees brushing. The air was heavy, charged with something unspoken. "Why do you stay?" Caleb asked suddenly, his voice low. "This town, it's eating you alive." Ethan's throat tightened. He wanted to lie, to say he was fine, but Caleb's eyes demanded the truth. "It's home," he said finally. "Only one I've got." Caleb's hand rested on the bale, inches from Ethan's. "Home doesn't have to be a place you're stuck in." His fingers brushed Ethan's, a fleeting touch that felt like a promise. Ethan didn't pull away. The ridge became their secret. 2 nights later, Ethan followed Caleb up the winding trail, the Montana night alive with crickets and starlight. They sat on a blanket Caleb had brought, the world spread out below them, vast and quiet. Ethan felt exposed, not just to the night but to Caleb, who sat close enough that their shoulders touched. "You were right," Ethan said, his voice soft. "The stars are something else." He didn't just mean the sky. Caleb's presence was its own constellation, bright and impossible to ignore. Caleb turned to him, his face half lit by moonlight. "Told you." His voice was gentle, but his eyes were intense, searching Ethan's. "You deserve more than that barn, Ethan. More than this town." Ethan's heart pounded, the words stirring a longing he'd tried to bury. "And what about you?" he asked, his voice barely steady. "You're just passing through. What's that make this?" Caleb's grin faded, replaced by something raw, unguarded. "I don't know," he admitted. "But I'm here now, and I see you." The words broke something in Ethan, a dam he'd built to keep himself safe. He leaned closer, their faces inches apart, the air between them electric. Caleb's hand found his, their fingers intertwining, and for a moment, the world was just them, 2 souls under an endless sky. They didn't kiss, not then, but the moment lingered, heavy with possibility. When they hiked back to the ranch, Ethan felt lighter, like he'd left some of his fear on the ridge. The next few days were a blur of stolen moments, brushes of hands, shared glances, quiet conversations in the barn. Ethan felt himself changing, the weight of Bozeman's judgment less heavy with Caleb near. But the town wasn't blind. Whispers started, glances lingered too long, and Ethan noticed Jake watching them, his eyes narrow with suspicion. One afternoon, as they repaired a fence, Caleb's hand lingered on Ethan's wrist, a touch that felt like a claim. Jake saw it, his jaw tightening. "Keep your head in the work, boys," he barked, but his tone held a warning Ethan couldn't ignore. That night, Ethan found Caleb waiting by the barn, his expression serious. "We need to be careful," Caleb said, his voice low. "This town, it's not kind to people like us." Ethan's stomach dropped. People like us. The words were a mirror, reflecting a truth he'd never spoken aloud. He nodded, his throat tight, but Caleb's hand squeezed his, a silent promise that they'd face it together. The next morning, disaster struck. A fire broke out in the east pasture, smoke billowing into the sky. Ethan and Caleb worked side by side, hauling water, herding panicked horses. In the chaos, their hands brushed, their eyes met, and for a moment, the world was just them again. But Jake was watching. When the fire was out, he pulled Ethan aside, his face hard. "I see what's going on," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "You think you can flaunt that here? You're gonna ruin yourself, kid." Ethan's heart sank, fear clawing at him. He wanted to deny it, to say Jake was wrong, but the truth was written in every glance he shared with Caleb. He looked across the field, where Caleb was calming a horse, his reckless smile gone, replaced by a fierce determination. That night, Ethan couldn't sleep. Jake's words echoed, mingling with Caleb's promise on the ridge. He was caught between fear and hope, between the life he'd always known and the one he was starting to want. When he finally drifted off, he dreamed of Caleb's hand in his, of a world where they didn't have to hide. The barn became their refuge, a place where the world's judgment couldn't reach. Ethan and Caleb stole moments there, their touches bolder, their conversations deeper. One evening, as they sat on a hay bale, Caleb's hand rested on Ethan's knee, a quiet claim that made Ethan's heart race. "I've never felt like this," Ethan admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "Not with anyone." Caleb's eyes softened, his thumb tracing circles on Ethan's knee. "Me neither," he said. "And I've been around." Ethan laughed, the sound easing the tension in his chest. But the fear was still there, a shadow that grew with every whisper he overheard, every glance from Jake. The town was closing in, and Ethan knew it. The next day, Caleb suggested they ride out to the ridge again. "Just us," he said, his grin reckless but his eyes earnest. Ethan agreed, desperate for a moment away from the ranch's watchful eyes. They rode out at dusk, the horses' hooves steady on the trail. At the ridge, they dismounted, sitting close under the stars. Caleb's hand found Ethan's, their fingers lacing together. "I want to stay," Caleb said suddenly, his voice rough. "For you." Ethan's breath caught, hope and fear colliding. "You don't know what you're saying," he whispered. "This town, it'll chew us up." "Then we leave," Caleb said, his grip tightening. Together. The word hung between them, a dream Ethan hadn't dared to imagine. He leaned in, their lips meeting in a kiss that was soft, then urgent, a promise sealed under the Montana sky. It was his first kiss, and it felt like freedom. But freedom came at a cost. The next morning, Jake confronted Ethan outside the barn, his face red with anger. "I warned you," he spat. "You and that drifter, you're done here." Ethan's world tilted. The ranch was his life, his home. Losing it meant losing everything, his family, his future. But as he looked at Caleb, who stood nearby, his jaw set, Ethan realized he had something worth fighting for. "I'm not ashamed," Ethan said, his voice shaking but firm. It was the first time he'd said it aloud, the first time he'd claimed himself. Jake's eyes narrowed, but before he could respond, Caleb stepped forward. "You got a problem, take it up with me," he said, his tone low, dangerous. Jake backed off, muttering threats, but the damage was done. The town would know soon enough. That night, Ethan and Caleb sat in the barn, their hands clasped. "We can't stay," Caleb said, his voice steady. "Not like this." Ethan nodded, his heart heavy but resolute. "Then we go," he said, echoing Caleb's words from the ridge. It was a leap into the unknown, but for the first time, Ethan wasn't afraid. They made a plan, save enough money, find a place where they could be themselves. It wouldn't be easy, but it was possible. As they sat there, the barn no longer felt like a cage. It was a beginning. The days that followed were a tightrope. Ethan and Caleb worked harder, saving every penny, their plan a fragile thread holding them together. The town's whispers grew louder, the stares sharper. Ethan's father confronted him one evening, his face a mask of disappointment. "You're throwing your life away," he said, his voice cold. "For what?" "For me," Ethan replied, his voice steady despite the ache in his chest. He walked away, his father's silence heavier than any words. Caleb was waiting in the barn, his eyes fierce. "You okay?" he asked, pulling Ethan into a hug. It was the first time they'd held each other so openly, and Ethan clung to him, the world's weight falling away. They started sneaking away at night, meeting at the ridge, where the stars felt like allies. Each kiss, each touch, was a rebellion against the town's judgment. Ethan felt himself growing bolder, his fear giving way to a quiet strength. Caleb was his anchor, his reason to keep going. But trouble was brewing. Jake had spread the word, and the ranch hands grew cold, their camaraderie replaced by sidelong glances. One night, as Ethan and Caleb worked late, a group of hands cornered them in the barn. "You don't belong here," one said, his voice thick with menace. Caleb stepped in front of Ethan, his fists clenched. "Back off," he growled, his reckless smile gone, replaced by a fire Ethan hadn't seen before. The hands hesitated, then left, but the threat lingered. "We need to go soon," Caleb said later, his voice urgent. "This place, it's not safe." Ethan nodded, his resolve hardening. They had enough saved for a bus ticket, a start somewhere new. The next night, They packed what little they owned, their hands brushing as they worked, a silent promise to face whatever came next together. As they slipped out of the barn, the night was quiet, the stars bright above. Ethan took one last look at the ranch, the only home he'd ever known. It hurt to leave, but the pain was outweighed by the hope in Caleb's eyes, the warmth of his hand in Ethan's. They boarded a bus at dawn, the Montana landscape fading behind them. Ethan's heart was heavy, but Caleb's shoulder against his was a reminder of what they were building, a life where they didn't have to hide. The bus rattled along, carrying Ethan and Caleb toward a new life. They didn't know where they'd end up, maybe Seattle, maybe somewhere smaller, but it didn't matter. They had each other, and that was enough. In their new town, they found a small apartment, a place to start over. Ethan got a job at a feed store, Caleb at a nearby stable. The work was familiar, grounding, but the freedom was new. They could hold hands in public, share a quiet kiss without fear. It wasn't perfect. There were still stares, still judgments, but it was theirs. One evening, as they sat on their tiny balcony, Caleb pulled Ethan close. "You ever miss the barn?" he asked, his voice soft. Ethan thought of the hay, the dust, the quiet moments where he'd first felt seen. "Sometimes," he admitted, "but I'd rather be here, with you." Caleb's smile was reckless, but it was also home. "Good," he said, kissing Ethan's forehead, "because I'm not going anywhere." They built a life, piece by piece. Ethan started writing, pouring his story into words, hoping to help others like him. Caleb took him riding on weekends, teaching him to love the open land again. They fought, they laughed, they grew together, their love a quiet rebellion against a world that hadn't always been kind. Years later, Ethan would look back on that barn, on the cowboy who'd walked in with muddy boots and a reckless smile. It wasn't just a moment, it was the start of everything. They'd found each other in a place that tried to break them, and they'd chosen to build something better. Their story wasn't perfect, but it was real. And under the stars, in a world they'd made their own, Ethan knew it was worth every risk, every fear, every step away from the barn where it all began.